129 people. Two of the finest ships in the British Royal Navy. The best equipment money could buy in the 19th century. And complete silence for 170 years. In 1845, Britain launched an expedition meant to be the crowning triumph of the empire. Only one stretch of ocean route remained undiscovered on the entire map of the world: the Northwest Passage, a sea path through the Arctic ice connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. Whoever crossed it first would be written into history books forever, remembered alongside the greatest explorers who ever lived. Instead, this expedition became one of the greatest mysteries in the history of Arctic exploration. A mystery that would take nearly 2 centuries to even partially unravel. The ships vanished. The entire crew vanished, all 129 of them, without a trace. Dozens of rescue missions were launched. Fortunes were spent. Years turned into decades of searching, and for most of that time, there was nothing. Just a handful of skeletons scattered across the ice, a few scattered relics, and chilling traces that the British initially refused to even acknowledge, let alone believe. It wasn't until 2014 and 2016, almost 2 centuries after the crew disappeared into the white silence of the Arctic, that oceanographers finally located what remained of the ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror resting on the seafloor. But even now, with the ships themselves sitting in front of us, mapped by sonar and explored by underwater drones, we still don't know for certain, step by step, exactly what killed every single one of those men. This is the story of people who set sail utterly convinced of their own invincibility, backed by the greatest empire on Earth. And it's the story of ice that, slowly and mercilessly, proved just how wrong they were. To understand why 129 men willingly agreed to this voyage, you first have to understand what Britain looked like in the middle of the 19th century. This was a nation sitting at the absolute peak of its global power, the strongest navy the world had ever seen, colonies scattered across every inhabited continent, trade routes spanning the entire globe. And yet, there remained one maddening blank spot left on the map of the British-dominated world: a narrow, treacherous strip of Arctic ice running north of Canada, through which, in theory, ships could sail directly from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, avoiding the long and dangerous detour around the southern tip of South America. Europeans had been chasing this route, this fabled Northwest Passage, for well over 3 centuries by that point. Dozens of expeditions had tried before. Dozens had failed, some catastrophically. The pack ice crushed wooden ships like matchsticks, and the merciless cold picked off men one by one, expedition after expedition, decade after decade. By 1845, only the final, relatively small stretch remained uncharted, and enormous glory awaited whoever managed to complete it, whoever could finally close that last gap on the map. Command of this prestigious mission was given to Sir John Franklin. He was 59 years old at the time, an age at which most naval captains had already long since retired to the comfort of shore. His record held both genuine successes and one deeply troubling chapter that many in the Admiralty would have preferred to forget. Back in 1819, he had led an overland expedition into the Canadian Arctic that ended in absolute disaster. 11 men under his command died slowly of starvation and exposure, and Franklin himself only survived by resorting to eating his own leather boots once every scrap of food had run out. The British press, never known for their gentleness, nicknamed him the man who ate his boots. Not exactly the reputation you'd hope for in someone about to be entrusted with command of a brand new, high-stakes Arctic expedition. And yet, despite all of this, he received the command anyway, partly through his social and political connections within the Admiralty, and partly, quite simply, because very few other qualified officers were willing to risk their own hard-earned reputations on such an uncertain gamble. The ships he was given for the voyage, however, were something else entirely, genuinely impressive vessels by any standard of the era. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had previously served as heavily armored warships, and both were now completely refitted specifically for the brutal demands of Arctic conditions. Their hulls were reinforced with iron plating built to withstand the crushing, grinding pressure of pack ice. Both ships carried steam engines, an unusual and expensive luxury for polar expeditions at the time, which allowed them to move under their own power even when there was no wind to fill their sails. And there was one particular detail that seemed like a tremendous advantage at the time, but would later, quietly and invisibly, turn into an outright curse: an enormous supply of canned food. This was a relatively new technology, meant to guarantee the crew fresh, edible provisions for years at a time, protecting them from the two ancient enemies of every long sea voyage: scurvy and outright starvation. 129 men. 3 full years' worth of carefully calculated supplies. The absolute finest technical equipment available anywhere in the world at that time. On paper, at least, everything looked utterly, perfectly ideal. On May 19th, 1845, the two ships finally set sail from England, departing to the cheers and waving handkerchiefs of an enthusiastic crowd gathered at the docks. None of the people waving goodbye that day, none of the families and friends and well-wishers, had any idea that they were seeing these men for the very last time in their lives. In July of 1845, still relatively early in the voyage, a group of whaling ships operating near the coast of Greenland spotted the two expedition vessels anchored nearby. This brief encounter turned out to be the very last confirmed contact anyone would ever have with the outside world. By all accounts, the crew appeared to be in excellent spirits, healthy, energetic, and absolutely brimming with enthusiasm for the journey ahead. A number of the sailors even took the opportunity to send letters home with the whalers, letters that were warm, cheerfully optimistic, and full of unshakable confidence in a swift and glorious success. And then silence. A complete, absolute, unbroken silence that would go on to stretch across years. At first, understandably, no one back in Britain was particularly alarmed by this. Polar expeditions of this scale routinely took a very long time to complete. There existed no practical way to send or receive communication once ships had sailed beyond the reach of other vessels, and a full year, or even 2, without any news at all was considered entirely normal, even expected. But then 1846 quietly passed without word. Then 1847 came and went as well. And then 1848 arrived. And still, after all that time, there had not been a single confirmed word from Franklin or any member of his crew. At this point, Britain finally, truly began to panic. And it was precisely here, at this critical moment, that a remarkable woman stepped into the spotlight, a woman without whom this entire story would almost certainly have unfolded very differently. Her name was Lady Jane Franklin, the missing captain's own wife. She flatly refused to simply accept the Admiralty's prolonged silence on the matter, and for years afterward, quite literally years, she relentlessly pressured the government, personally funded numerous rescue expeditions out of her own considerable fortune, wrote passionate letters to every influential figure she could reach, and even went so far as to appeal directly to the President of the United States for assistance. It was largely thanks to her sheer, unwavering persistence that the search efforts never fully stopped, even during periods when official Britain seemed all too ready to quietly write the entire expedition off as a tragic and permanent loss. Eventually, the British government announced a truly staggering reward, considering the era, £20,000 sterling, to be given to absolutely anyone who could locate any trace whatsoever of Franklin's expedition, or who could help rescue any surviving members of the crew. This enormous financial incentive triggered a genuine wave of search expeditions launched from multiple different countries, each one meticulously combing through the vast, icy Arctic expanse in the desperate hope of finding anything at all, any clue, any wreckage, any sign of life. Years passed in this manner, and still nothing turned up. The Arctic, it seemed, knew exactly how to keep its secrets buried deep beneath the ice. The first genuine breakthrough in this long, frustrating search finally came in 1850, and what the searchers discovered immediately hinted that something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong, and far earlier in the voyage than anyone back home had ever suspected. On a small, desolate patch of land known as Beachy Island, search parties stumbled upon three graves. Three carefully, almost tenderly arranged burial sites belonging to crew members who had died back in the winter of 1846, meaning these deaths occurred within the very first few months of the entire voyage, long before anyone in Britain had even begun to seriously worry about the expedition's fate. The Arctic permafrost had preserved the bodies so remarkably well that when anthropologists finally exhumed them more than a century later, in the 1980s, the faces of these long-dead sailors were still, hauntingly, recognizable. Three deaths occurring this early into the expedition was already an extremely ominous sign of things to come. But the real, deeper truth still lay somewhere further ahead. And crucially, it wasn't British sailors who first brought this truth to light. It was the local Inuit people, whose testimony British searchers spent years stubbornly, arrogantly refusing to take seriously. The Inuit, who had lived on and thrived in this unforgiving territory for countless centuries, and who understood the true nature of the Arctic in ways no European explorer ever fully could, told the visiting search parties about groups of white men they had personally seen out on the sea ice. Exhausted, gaunt figures, dragging heavy wooden boats behind them by hand, trudging desperately through deep snow in what appeared to be a last, desperate attempt to reach some form of civilization. But the British explorers of that era, deeply steeped in the colonial prejudices of their time, spent years simply dismissing these first-hand accounts as nothing more than unreliable tales told by savages. This dismissal, this refusal to listen, turned out to be a costly mistake, one that delayed the search for the truth by many, many years. The truly decisive breakthrough finally arrived in 1854, when the Scottish explorer John Ray encountered a group of Inuit hunters and received from them a piece of undeniable physical evidence. A set of silver cutlery, forks and spoons, still bearing the engraved initials of several officers from Franklin's expedition. But alongside this physical proof, the Inuit also passed along something far more disturbing, far more difficult to accept. Detailed, consistent accounts describing marks found on the bodies of the dead that could really only mean one horrifying thing: cannibalism. The last remaining survivors, driven to complete and utter desperation by relentless, prolonged starvation, had resorted to eating the bodies of their own dead companions in a final, grim attempt to stay alive. When John Ray returned home to Britain and published this deeply unsettling report, British society erupted in furious, indignant outrage. But that outrage, tellingly, wasn't directed at the horrifying reality of what had actually happened to these men out on the ice. Instead, it was directed squarely at Ray himself for having dared to repeat the words of so-called savages concerning the fate of civilized British gentlemen. Even Charles Dickens, one of the single most influential and widely read writers of the entire era, publicly and forcefully denounced Ray's findings, flatly calling the Inuit testimony an outright lie, unworthy of belief. Lady Franklin herself, still clinging to hope, also refused to accept the report and used every ounce of her considerable social influence in a determined effort to discredit it entirely. It would ultimately take more than a full century for mainstream history to finally, properly acknowledge that John Ray had, in fact, been right all along. Without question, the single most important discovery in this entire two-century saga came in 1859, when an expedition led by Francis Leopold McClintock found, on the desolate shores of King William Island, the only written document that any member of the Franklin expedition would ever leave behind for the world to find. It was just a small, unassuming sheet of paper, carefully folded and sealed inside a metal cylinder. And yet, within those few handwritten lines, an entire sweeping tragedy was laid bare. The note reported, in stark and matter-of-fact language, that the ships had become trapped in thick ice all the way back in September of 1846. In other words, Erebus and Terror hadn't simply been stuck for a few inconvenient weeks or even months, as many had assumed. They had spent multiple long years locked helplessly in place by the ice, with absolutely no way to move forward toward their goal, and no way to turn back toward safety either. Sir John Franklin himself, the note revealed, had died on June 11th, 1847. The precise cause of his death was never recorded anywhere in the note, and remains genuinely, frustratingly unknown to historians even to this very day. By April of 1848, less than a full year after Franklin's own death, 24 additional officers and crewmen had also perished. These were catastrophic, staggering losses for an expedition of this particular size and level of preparation. And then came the final, heaviest line of the entire note. The 105 men who remained alive had made the desperate decision to abandon their ice-locked ships entirely and set out on foot, hoping against hope to reach mainland Canada and the nearest trading posts before it was too late. Take a moment to really picture that march. Hundreds of kilometers of walking across endless, unforgiving ice, in temperatures brutal enough to kill an unprepared person within just a few short hours. And here's what makes this particular detail especially chilling, especially haunting. When later search parties eventually found the boats and sledges these desperate men had abandoned along their route, they didn't find stockpiles of food or precious fuel inside. Instead, they found silver forks and spoons, leather-bound books, even pieces of formal toiletry sets, items the sailors had apparently still considered necessities of a civilized man, but which, out there in the merciless Arctic wilderness, amounted to nothing more than dead, pointless, ultimately fatal weight. Not one single man among these 105 survivors ever made it to safety. Not one. Here, finally, is the central question that haunted and puzzled historians for well over a century. Why exactly did experienced, well-trained sailors, equipped with 3 full years' worth of carefully planned provisions, end up dying so quickly and in such overwhelming numbers? Modern science, drawing on decades of forensic and archaeological research, now offers several compelling answers, And the honest truth, most researchers now agree, likely wasn't any single disease acting alone, but rather a genuinely lethal combination of several devastating factors striking all at once. The first major theory involves lead poisoning. Back in the 1980s, the anthropologist Owen Beatty carefully exhumed the bodies originally found on Beechey Island, and in the process discovered alarmingly high levels of lead present in their preserved bones and hair. The likely source of all this lead, researchers believe, was the very thing the expedition had once been so proud of: its extensive supply of canned provisions. Canning technology at that particular point in history was still genuinely imperfect. The cans themselves were sealed shut using lead-based solder, which would gradually, invisibly leach directly into the food stored inside. Chronic, sustained lead poisoning of this kind is known to cause paranoia, mental confusion, physical weakness, and seriously impaired judgment, which could plausibly help explain some of those same bizarre, irrational decisions, like choosing to drag heavy silver forks across the ice instead of desperately needed food. The second major theory centers on scurvy, the classic and much feared disease of sailors throughout history, caused directly by a prolonged lack of vitamin C in the daily diet. This disease would have steadily, relentlessly broken down bodies that were already weakened by cold, exhaustion, and hunger, leaving the men increasingly defenseless against absolutely any additional threat that came their way. The third theory points simply to food poisoning. The private contractor responsible for supplying the expedition's canned provisions, as later investigations revealed, had rushed carelessly to fulfill his lucrative contract and had significantly, dangerously cut corners on proper manufacturing standards throughout the process. A meaningful portion of the expedition's supplies could very plausibly have already been spoiled or contaminated with harmful bacteria even before the ships ever left England. And then there's the fourth theory, the one most strongly and consistently confirmed by recent modern research, which turns out to be, in the end, both the simplest and the most genuinely terrible explanation of all: outright starvation. Detailed analysis of bones recovered along the men's desperate retreat route, conducted during the 2010s using modern forensic techniques, finally and conclusively confirmed exactly what the Inuit people had been saying all along, ever since the 1850s. The human bones in question do indeed show distinct cutting marks entirely consistent with cannibalism. And careful isotope analysis further reveals clear, unmistakable signs of prolonged, severe starvation during the final desperate months of these men's lives. The Inuit, disbelieved and dismissed for well over a century, had in fact been telling the complete truth from the very beginning. Now, let's turn to the ships themselves. For an incredibly long time, they remained by far the biggest unsolved piece of this entire puzzle. Two enormous vessels, seemingly lost forever somewhere within the vast Arctic waters, actively sought by dozens of separate expeditions across more than a century and a half, without a single genuine success. HMS Erebus wasn't finally located until 2014, discovered near King William Island, resting at a depth shallow enough to allow underwater drones to thoroughly explore and document it in remarkable detail. And then, just 2 years later in 2016, HMS Terror was found as well, and remarkably, astonishingly well preserved, nearly fully intact, resting quietly at the bottom of a bay that the local Inuit had actually been calling by their own traditional name for centuries upon centuries, a name that roughly translated to something like the place where the ship is. They had known precisely where it lay this entire time. Nobody had ever simply thought to properly ask them. Deep inside the wreck of Terror, underwater exploration drones managed to capture genuinely astonishing footage. Sealed, unopened bottles of wine still resting in their racks, neatly and carefully arranged porcelain dishware, remarkably well-preserved officers' cabins, an entire scene frozen perfectly in time, a haunting snapshot of ordinary daily life that abruptly, permanently came to a stop in the middle of an unforgiving icy wasteland. Today, nearly 2 full centuries after it all began, the story of the Franklin expedition has grown into something far more significant than just a gripping adventure tale. It has become, for many historians, an important and lasting lesson about the real, lasting cost of prejudice. Modern historians have now, finally, officially acknowledged what the Inuit people actually knew and were openly reporting all the way back in the 1850s. The grim reality of cannibalism, the exact retreat route the men had taken, and even the approximate location of the 2 sunken ships themselves. Britain, as an institution, spent well over a full century stubbornly dismissing the rich oral tradition of these indigenous peoples, simply because of a deeply ingrained colonial conviction that supposedly civilized European explanations were always inherently more trustworthy than the direct testimony of the very people who actually, genuinely knew this unforgiving land. Both ships now officially hold the protected status of National Historic Sites of Canada, and careful underwater excavation work continues on both wrecks to this very day. Every single year, dedicated researchers manage to recover new artifacts that help gradually complete our overall picture of the expedition's tragic final months. But even with all of our impressive modern technology, sophisticated underwater drones, advanced genetic analysis, precise isotope testing, the central, defining mystery at the heart of this story still ultimately remains unsolved. The physical remains of the vast majority of these 129 men have still never actually been found anywhere. We still don't know, with any real certainty, exactly what happened to that very last group of desperate survivors after they left their note behind on King William Island. They walked off somewhere into the vast white distance. And somewhere out there, most likely, they still lie today, quietly resting beneath the endless Arctic snow. The Franklin expedition originally set sail as a proud, confident symbol of British greatness. The very finest ships available, the very finest equipment money could buy, the most experienced and capable officers of the entire age. Everything that both cutting-edge technology and boundless human ambition could possibly offer in the 19th century. And yet it ultimately ended as a sobering story about just how genuinely helpless even the most powerful empire on Earth can become in the face of raw, indifferent nature, especially when that empire stubbornly refuses to listen to the people who actually, truly know the land. 129 men set out to sea together in the summer of 1845, full of hope and confidence. Not a single one of them ever made it back home again. And it took a full 170 years before the Arctic ice finally, slowly began giving up their long-buried story, releasing it in scattered fragments, reluctantly, grudgingly surrendering its secrets one small piece at a time. Perhaps, somewhere beneath all that endless snow, or resting quietly at the bottom of that icy sea, the final answers are still waiting to be found. Answers to questions that humanity has now been asking for nearly 2 full centuries. If you enjoyed this story, please hit like and subscribe, because there are many more fascinating mysteries coming to this channel. Mysteries that have been waiting a very long time for someone to finally tell their answers.